Hi, everybody. My name is Shrey. I am one of the co-curators of the exhibition, and I believe Mustafa is having a bit of a problem joining on. I'll have a message notifying me when he joins. Until then, I will just briefly introduce you to the exhibition and what this run through will consist of. Um, the exhibition Bhuri by My Life as an Artist is the culmination of a little longer than 6 months of work, which included research, writing, rewriting, speaking with the author herself multiple times, and also looking at a lot of literature, not on Bhuribai's own work, because very little of that exists, but rather on indigenous art in India, the context in which indigenous art saw boom in India, both commercially and within art circles and collector circles, and also literature on what caused this particular boom. Um, my colleague Mustafa has written an excellent essay that will go with the exhibition that you will have access to. It's a long essay, so he will run you through the essay as sort of a background, a sort of a context setting for this exhibition, and in the meanwhile, I will run you through the exhibition itself. Um, to begin with, there is a lot to be said about Bhumibai's work, and to put an exhibition together charting her life as an artist is has meant that the exhibition is one that takes a while to go through. Uh, but given that we have what we have done is we've broken up the narrative, the artist's own narrative, and the narrative, the larger exhibition's narrative, into three portions, and it also has an accompanying film. The exhibition has an accompanying film that's still in the works. But the three larger parts of the exhibition is what we'll take you through. Um, and the first part is a narrative of Puribai's early years, her growing up in the place she grew up in Madhya Pradesh. It's a little village called Pithol, and the first 15 years of her life was spent there. And this first segment of the exhibition is composed of autobiographical paintings that Bhuribai did, that MAP commissioned into 2018, and it's narrated in her own words, translated into English, of course. The second part is more reliant on research, a lot of documentary evidence, of course, conversations with the artist, digging through photo archives, not just Puribai's own, but also those of Bharat Bhavan, um, and others associated with Puribai during the last 40 years. It is composed as a combination of both the curator's own voice as well as some quotes from Bhuribai to illustrate certain points, and many, many photographs. And the third segment that Mustafa will particularly be leading you through, and it's a large segment, is a comparative reading of Bhuribai's own artwork and looking at artworks from the late 80s and more recent works. All of the paintings that you'll see in this last segment are those that are held in MAP's collection. So that is the sort of loose structure of the exhibition. Mm, I see Mustafa has joined us. I'm going to
Hi.
hand it over to him, and he'll begin, like I said, by. Oh, sorry, Mustafa had finished. I gave them a breakup of the structure, so I'm just going to carry
Sure,
on with the first segment of the exhibition. Um,
sure.
I'm just about to pull up my screen where you will be able to see the exhibition for yourself. Just here you go. This is segment one of the exhibition. Um, The works that you're about to see, indeed the works that make up this entire first segment, are very vibrant, very detailed, very meticulously put together tableaus. But before I go into that, I want to tell you a little bit about who Bhuribai is. Bhuribai is uh, a lady, the first of her community to paint in using modern materials and techniques. Now, Bhuribai belongs to the Bhil community. She grew up in a very small village, like I said, called Pitol in Madhya Pradesh, very close to the border of Gujarat. And for the for the first 15 years of her life, she lived in that village. She barely went out except if it was in search of work. And she grew up watching something that is known as the Pithora tradition. Now, the Bhil uh, give a great deal of importance to forefathers, and they believe that their forefathers are watching. So after a person passes, they continue to watch over you in the form of Baba Dev, and Baba Dev rides a horse. Now, the Bhil, to commemorate those who have passed, have a mural painting tradition called the Pithora painting tradition. Now, Pithora is painted on the walls of people's houses, and this painting it is practiced across Bhil communities in Madhya Pradesh, in Gujarat, in parts of Maharashtra, wherever the Bhils live. There, they have always had a high priest come in and do Pithora painting. What sets it apart is that it is a form of painting that only men do, and women aren't allowed to do it. It is considered highly ritual. And so that is the extent of the painting tradition that exists within the Bhil community. Um, as we go into the exhibition, Pithora painting is something that heavily influenced Puribai, but it is very important for us to take a moment and um, acknowledge that in a community where there was no tradition of women painting, indeed of even young girls painting, here's somebody that began painting because she enjoyed it as a child, and later by serendipitous meeting, she is almost at the center of what the market or what we as artists in urban areas, what we understand as Bhil art. She's at the center of it. You can almost call her a pioneer, because at the point that she began painting, nothing called Bhil art existed. Right. Um, so when we enter part one, the story of her life, uh, we enter with chapter one. The the images that you're about to see are put together using sorry, one moment, using paintings that Bhuribai did. Like I said, when we were putting this exhibition together, we were faced with two problems. One is, how do we put forward an exhibition on an artist whose work has been exhibited so many times, not just in India, but abroad? When we visited Bhuribai, she showed me piles and piles of catalogs that she had. And she said, my work has been showed. I know it's been showed in many places, but I can't read and I can't write. And I don't know what they've said about my work. I don't know what they've named my paintings, because I don't name my paintings. So we realized, the author's own voice was missing when her work had been exhibited thus far, with the exception of maybe two exhibitions weren't like that. And B, we realized that if we were to change the way exhibitions were being done on Bhuribai's work, we'd have to enter into a period of prolonged conversation to her to get a grip on why she paints what she paints, how she came to paint what she paints. I mean, everybody knows the origin story, but how did she came to paint exactly what she paints? How did she develop her style? What happened? What is the real story? Uh, how did somebody coming from Bhopal, how did she come to be an artist? What was the process? So we spent, like I said, around 6 months engaged in conversation with Bhuribai, and most of what you will see, most of the text that appears in front of you, that you will also read later on, I'd like to say that it's all directly quoted from these conversations that we had with Bhuribai. And so this particular segment, especially part one, is entirely narrated in her words, because we don't have time. You won't be able to read each slide. So I'll sort of lead you through this part of the narrative. It begins, it begins from her birth in the village. Moti Bawdi in Pithol is where Bhuribai grew up. She had a large family. They had many siblings. Um, and Pithol is located in the Jhabua district, which is surrounded by greenery, entirely, completely surrounded by greenery, and all aspects of life that Bhuribai remembers from this period is somehow tied to nature and her surroundings. The house they lived in was made of mud and leaves. Her mother was at home, but she would often go to work in the fields. Her sister and her grew up in this sort of a uh, in a sort of milieu where they were constantly in touch with nature. And she says that they were extremely poor, and people wouldn't lend them water because they were afraid they wouldn't get it back. But despite being very poor, they managed to make ends meet. Sometimes they would collect mahua flowers. Here you can see it depicted in the top left corner where my cursor is. Um, they would collect mahua flowers and sell them, although mahua is used at home. Um, Sometimes her sister would teach her how to weed the fields. Here are the little fields you see, and so on. By the time Bhuri Bai was around 6 or 7 years old, she began accompanying her parents to work. They would go to plow nearby fields that didn't belong to them, that belonged to landlords, and she would follow along with her parents. And there she came into greater contact with, with bullocks, with rows of plants, with the way farming was done. She helped out as much as she could, but she wasn't always great at it. She recounts very fondly how her mother would tell her, that's, you're picking the wrong plant. That's the crop. That's a weed. And so by the time she was very young, although she was working from a very young age, there was also a lot of leisure in her life, and she remembers this with a lot of clarity. She says these are memories she likes to fall back on, and indeed, motifs from these memories find their way into her later works. They continue to appear in her paintings. For example, you see these trees, they are jamun trees, and they're linked to a very special memory. She talks about how, as children, they would all gather and walk very early in the morning when it was still dark. They would walk to her sister's village, to her sister's in law's village. And all these kids, they would climb the tree and eat the berries and then walk back home because they didn't have a berry tree in their home. Um, and so these are memories that she holds close, but these are also memories that play a large part in the art she will create later on, because the birds you see, the animals you see eating the fruit, this sort of coexistence that you see on screen of plants and children and birds. This is a thematic that she carries into her life, into the work she produces even later in life. By the time she was 12 or 13, they had begun taking the cattle out to graze. By the time she was 8, but until she was 13 at least, she was taking the cattle out to graze. That was her responsibility. And every day they would gather, all the kids would gather and go together to this little grazing ground with rolling low hills on one side, a lovely stream on the other end, and a little rock from where they would sit and observe the animals. The rock is part of local legend, and they would sit by it and they would watch the animals. And she also talks about how when the stream would, flood, she would hold on to the tail of a buffalo and cross it. So when she produced this series of paintings, I mean, the exhibition didn't exist then, but we realized that these are all scenarios that are some of her primary memories from these periods, but they also show a sort of whimsical longing for that childhood that was very soon to be cut short. By the time she was 15, it was almost gone. I'm sorry, I'm just going to scroll through this because there's a lot of text and you can take your time to read it later on. When she was 13, because they were poor, because they couldn't make ends meet, because just farming somebody else's land wasn't enough. Puribai and her sister, her older sister, what they began doing is, because they were surrounded by forests, they would go to the forest, they would cut down trees, they would dry the branches, then form little bundles, tie them up, get on a train, a very irregular train, and then they would go to very faraway towns, such as Dahod in Gujarat, to sell these bundles of wood. Now, the chain you see, uh, although now she draws things like she paints trains and cars into her paintings, these are things that appear in her paintings only in context to when she has seen them. You'll understand what I mean in the next segment, but I'd just like to point that out here. So she talks about how the train was never on time, and they almost sort of had to grow up very quickly and travel by themselves on the train because there was nobody else to accompany them, and often the train would be late. And she describes it very vividly, how they would come back very late after selling the wood, and sometimes it would be late at night, and they'd still have to walk home alone because they couldn't stay um, in the station. Chapter 5, which is personally a favorite little part of this narrative, is these sort of very monochrome stick like motifs you'll see, which we actually later found out on conversation with Bhuribai that they are tattoos, they're traditional Bhil tattoos. Now, the Bhil have a belief that almost everybody's tattooed, but they also have a belief that, when you pass, if you don't have tattoos on your face and your body, how will God recognize you in heaven? So it was quite the norm for everybody to have tattoos, and there would be a little tattoo man. It was called Godna. There was a little tattoo guy who would come, and he would travel with the weekly markets. And Puribai shows herself in the center. Here you can see her with her sister and a cousin waiting to get tattooed. So Bhuribai got her first tattoos when she was 13, and even now, if you see photographs of her, um, you'll recognize some of these tattoos on her. But what is also interesting is that almost all of her paintings, especially the early ones, you see these little tattoo motifs uh, just, interspersed. At first, you wonder what they are. They look very symbolic, and you're not sure what they are. But if you look closely, they're actually repeated variations of these triangles, of these trees, of these little designs. Sometimes she'll substitute a natural looking peacock for a very tattoo inspired peacock. You'll see that in later paintings. And then there's little, she's also told us where she has some of these tattoos. And the facial tattoos you see here are exactly the ones Puribai has herself. She has it over the eyebrows, by her eyes, on her chin. And so this is another part of growing up. By the time she was 15, she said she was quite heavily tattooed. She had almost had all her tattoos by that time. And we come to the end of phase one, part one of this exhibition with chapter 6. When Bhuribai was 14 or 15, their little house in the village caught fire. Now, to this day, she's not sure whether it was set fire to, whether it caught fire by itself, whether it was an accident. Nobody's sure. Bhuribai and her own father were away traveling, earning money, and when they came back, they saw that the house was completely burnt down. And by some chance, her mother managed to escape with her siblings, but the animals and the livestock were all dead, despite many of the villagers' efforts to put the fire out. And Bhuribai sort of holds this as a very symbolic moment, she says, because after the fire, it was almost as if life in the village was coming to a close. Because a year or so later, she was married and she left. And even today, she goes back to the village, but maybe once a year. And she says, nothing is ever the same. So as much as possible, I try to go back to the village and remember these little memories that I hold so close. But it's none of it is the same. And so by the time Bhuribai is 15, by the time she's 16 or 17, we can't be sure because she's not sure of her birth date or her marriage age. but perhaps by our estimate, by we calculated it with her, maybe by the time she was 17, she's married and she moves to Bhopal, and that is where the next phase. That's where that's where her story as an artist emerges. Just a moment, I'm going to take you to the next portion. Right. The text says this next phase of Bhuribai's career began over 5 days in 1980, where she made her first series of paintings on a roll of brown wrapping paper for Jagdish Swaminathan in Bharat Bhavan, opening up new possibilities of colors, mediums, and techniques. Um, in the year 1980, 1980 was the year Bhuribai moved. She was 17. She moved to Bhopal. It wasn't as if she hadn't been to Bhopal before. She would travel to Bhopal with her father to work sometimes. But this is when she was moving for good because she was married and she was moving into her husband's house. So this brings us to the timeline that we've put together. And this timeline traces what happens after Bhuribai's arrival in Bhopal, because this is sort of where her story as an artist, in the more formal sense, begins. Because although Bhuribai was painting as a child, you haven't seen it in the previous chapters, but I'd like to bring it up now. She recalls that as a child, she was very fascinated by Pithora painting. She would stand in, maybe perhaps when she was 6 or 7, she would stand and watch Pithora painting being done. And because she was a little girl, she'd often get told to go away and say, don't be a nuisance, go away. Kurt shouldn't watch this. Except she was completely fascinated by it, and out of no instruction other from anybody else, and simply because she liked it, she decided, maybe I should paint too. And so she began making color out of soot. Black she made out of soot, red soil to make the color red, dried leaves or green fresh leaves, she made a paste of them to create green. She used turmeric to make yellow, and then using her fingers or twigs wrapped in cloth, she would make drawings when she was a child. Her mother encouraged her, but it was always looked at as very decorative, not very special, and definitely not something that was to be encouraged, because she painted very briefly as a child, and only when there was an occasion, and eventually it fizzled out. So by the time she came to the village, she wasn't painting anymore. Um, so in 1980, what happens is, two things happen. A, Bhuribai herself moved to Bhopal, but B, the Bharat Bhavan was being set up. Now, the Madhya Pradesh government set up Bharat Bhavan as a multidisciplinary arts center, and one of the branches of Bharat Bhavan would be a visual art gallery, and sorry, not a branch, actually, a wing of the Bharat Bhavan would focus on visual art. And they appointed writer Jagdish Swaminathan to be the director of Rupankar. The wing was called Rupankar. Now, this is interesting, but it is also serendipitous that Bhuribai is in Bhopal at the same time, because Bharat Bhavan is being built, and Bhuribai, like many other young Bhil people who have traveled to the city looking for work, either post-marriage or even before marriage, they find that a lot of construction sites are willing to employ them. So while Bhuribai's husband begins to work in the PWD, he finds her work as a construction worker at the Bharat Bhavan site. And this little combination of Bharat Bhavan, Swaminathan being there, and Bhuribai being there turns out to be it turns out to be the turning point, really. Because what happens is that it is there when she's working that one day Swaminathan is talking to the workers and he says, who amongst you knows how to draw? And Bhuribai is very shy. She doesn't step up, but her sister sort of nudges her forward and says, this is my sister, and she would draw back in the village. And so Swaminathan supplies Bhuribai with a roll of paper. She's very nervous. She's very hesitant. But he says, I'll pay you. You don't have to worry about losing your physical labor wages. I'll actually pay you. Please, would you paint for me? And so for the first time, perhaps after 10 years of not painting, Bhuribai sits down to paint. Except this time, this is not the fingers that she's used to. This is not standing and painting on a wall. And this is certainly not the colors that she's mixed out of earth or out of leaves. Swaminathan presents her with paints, with poster paints, with paintbrushes, and a roll of paper. And these are materials Bhuribai has never encountered before. And so, over a course of 5 days, she teaches herself how to use the brush, how to use colors. These are colors she's never seen before. Um, and so begins her journey as an artist. I mean, it really began out of a very serendipitous meeting. Um, it is interesting that Swaminathan is out looking for people who can paint, because this is a period, as Mustafa will tell you later, this is a period in Indian art where there is a large drive amongst artists, amongst art practitioners, to go back to their roots, so to speak, and sort of look back at what they termed living traditions, traditions of art that already existed but were looked at more as ritualistic or functional and not really as art. And they believed, people like Swaminathan believed that there were lay people in the villages who were creating art in more ritual context, and they wanted to bring them into the fold of the word artist. And so it was only natural that he was asking these young Bhil migrants about painting. So, that is what happens. So she paints, she makes these paintings, and Swaminathan buys them at 10 rupees per day. He pays her 10 rupees per day, and then he goes away. Now Bhuribai goes back to being a construction worker. She needs to support her little family. She's already had a daughter in the meanwhile, and the paintings that she made, Swaminathan takes away with him, and he visits her intermittently about every couple of months. And every time he comes, he brings supplies, and she paints. And when he goes away, she's not painting. What is interesting is that very few of these early paintings survive. We have photographs of these paintings that Jyoti Bhatt, photographer Jyoti Bhatt, took for Bharat Bhavan. One of them is part of the exhibition. You can see it, the one that my cursor is at. But very few of these survive. I believe if we had a chance to look at them closely, it would tell us so much more about what it was like for a young Bhuribai to, sit down, encounter these materials she hadn't seen, um, and paint. The first time she was painting, she said, "What do I paint? I didn't know what to paint." And thus she had to sort of come up with subjects to paint, because Swaminathan said, "I won't coach you. You paint what you want to." And so, as a result, ever since then, all the paintings that Bhuribai has made have very little to do with what she's. I mean, nobody asks her to make something. What she chooses to paint is something she decides when she faces the paper. There's very little planning involved, even today. That's what she says to us. What happened is that eventually, because Swaminathan was lobbying for indigenous art, people like Jangat Singh Sham, Pema Fatya, Lado Bai, other indigenous artists were also sort of being brought into the fold of, formally producing art. Um, Swaminathan sort of writes to the government of Madhya Pradesh, and Bhuribai wins her first award. In 1986, which is 6 years after she first picks up a paintbrush, she is awarded the Shikhar Samman, and this sort of changes everything for her, because the way it works is that once she has the Shikhar Samman, which is one of the highest civilian awards, people start talking about her. Swaminathan is already circulating her work. She begins to receive commissions, and she begins working here and there. She was producing work for museums, but she continues also working as a laborer, as a daily wage laborer. She's still not in possession of a formal job. And by the time the 90s come around, in the early 90s, Bhuribai falls very terribly ill. And the next 10 years, starting with the early 90s, are a period of immense hardship for her. In fact, before we spoke to her, there was almost no indication. I mean, no way would we have known that she was so sick. And she shows us photographs from this period, of which there are very few. This is one of them, the one you see here. But she's very sick. And despite being sick, And despite having an illness which nobody is really able to point to, there's no cure, she's trying various medicines. She continues to paint. Once again, this painting is happening very much in bursts, because by now she's still not decided, this is how I'm going to make my livelihood. But by the end of the 90s, what happens is, as she's traveling more and more, giving workshops on Bhil art, talking about um, how she came to be an artist, she realizes, oh wait, there is actually a demand for my work out there. There is, people will buy this. And so what happens is, she starts producing artwork by herself and selling it to support herself. um, she travels to Delhi in 1995, and when she travels to the city, as she experiences life, she also builds her repertoire of motifs. For example, she learns to incorporate cars into her art when she travels to Delhi for the first time, because a customer comes and says, can you please make me a drawing of a car? And she says, I've never drawn a car. I've only drawn what I've seen in the farms, what I remember from my life in the village. And so he sketches the car for her. And since then, cars are a part of her repertoire, and so on. Um, by the end of the 90s, Bhuribai, as well as the idea of Bhil art, is something that has taken shape, is a tangible thing within art world. People are talking about it, and people are also starting to notice indigenous art and artists much more. And so in 1999, there is a very interesting encounter that takes place. Bhuribai meets Jangar Singh Sham, who she already knows from before, but they're introduced to two Australian indigenous artists, Jambawa Maravili and Kethi Maravili. And the government say to them, your work looks very similar. You should totally do a work together. You should collaborate with each other. And Bhuribai recounts uh, feeling very stumped. She says, our work was not similar at all. Maybe on the surface it looks similar, but I was surprised that people would think it's similar just because we're indigenous artists, because our works are, they come from such different places. Um, and so on. So by the end of the 1990s and the beginning of 2002, Puribai approaches the Adivasi Lok Kala Academy, who has she is by now an established artist, and she says to them, um, I'm skilled. I'm an artist. I have been terribly ill. I can barely make ends meet. I almost thought, she says, I'm not sure I'm going to live much longer. Please, I need a job. And once again, this is another pivotal point in her life, because for the first time at the age of 40 something, she finally has the formal job, which is that of an artist at the Adivasi Lok Kala Academy, where she continues until today, until almost 5 years ago. She was doing monthly illustrations of their magazines, other publications, and these covers almost worked as her own practice ground, because as she did more of these, she was also building her own style. And by the mid 2000s and the 2010s, we have counted more than 15 exhibitions that have taken place on Bhuribai's work. A lot of these older works they no longer exist. We weren't able to track down so many of these older works, although the new ones are much easier because she's now learned how to do her signature. So we know that everything that is signed was produced post 2002. But the older works are not so easy to sort of find. And today, Bhuribai continues to live in Bhopal. She's formally employed as an artist at the Tribal Museum in Bhopal, which is right in the center of Bhopal. And interestingly, it is something that the entire building she worked on to, when she was a daily wage worker. This is one of the buildings that she sort of had put together as in brick and mortar. So she continues to work out of there. She has a little desk. She sits and works there. And most days, if you visit the museum, you can meet her there. And that is a very compressed version of essentially her trajectory as an artist. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Mustafa, and he's now going to take you through the last segment of the exhibition, which is works by Bhuribai, and then he'll talk a little bit about the essay that accompanies this exhibition. Thank you.
Thanks, Shreya. Just a second, I'll switch to the presentation. Yeah, so this is the fourth part of the exhibition and the last part. And while there are quite a few paintings of Bhuribais that we show there, for the walkthrough, we've chosen a selection of them to give you a sense of how her style developed as her career and life progressed as well. So this painting is probably from the early 80s, soon after she started working at Bharat Bhavan. And as you can see here, she's using mainly the colors that she was probably used to when she was still living in her village. So that's red, black, yellow, and green to lesser extents. And a lot of these motifs are also, if you recall the tattoos that Shrey mentioned earlier, the motifs are very similar to those. And others are simple flora and fauna that she was probably painting in her village as well. You'll also see that the composition, and the composition is a very important thing. The composition is something she's still sort of figuring out at this stage because she's not used to working on a small surface like paper, right? She's used to working on murals back home. So we'll see how that changes over time. This is an example of Pithora horses, uh, which is it's one of two major kinds that you find, at least in terms of what Buribai is familiar with. And here, these opposing triangles, this is the horse, and the stick figure on top is the rider. And you'll find that very often horses and riders are depicted together. And here also you can see that the composition is not like it's a repetition of a motif, but it's not composed into a scene as such. You know, it's she's showing you a sort of self-contained image multiple times, and that is part of the tradition of painting that she came from. Here, this is another Pithora horse, another style of Pithora horses, and here the horse is a little more clear. You know, the legs are there, and the opposing triangles are still there, and so is the rider, but more fleshed out. Again, you see that the motif is repeated, and that is the composition. But here she started to use dots. This I mean, it's not like this painting is necessarily before or immediately after the previous ones, but it's a stylistic uh, characteristic that she kind of starts experimenting with, possibly as a result of interacting with other artists like Janda Singh Sham, who was her contemporary at Bharat Bhavan. And the dots is something that is worth paying attention to. So peacocks are a frequently recurring motif in her work. Here you will notice that the peacocks seem to be standing on two hills. In reality, this scene, and she does this a few times actually. This scene is of two peacocks standing on a hill, and there are people who are also sort of hiding in the hills. You'll find that usually it's the peacocks and the flora who are very clearly depicted as though they're on the surface of the hill, and others who are hiding are shown as though they're inside the hill. And in this case, as you can see in the description, it's a thief who wants to ambush an unsuspecting passerby, which was a common incident near where she lived. You will see this is something very similar to the previous composition. And these are also scenes that she's starting to depict, which is quite significant because she goes on to focus much more on that later. And occasionally she will, and this is something only she only did in the early period, where she started to uh, show the peacock's tail as so many individual feathers, whereas Later, she sort of discontinued that and she preferred the triangular form. But here, still, you can see the people who are hiding in the hills and the vegetation that's growing on top of them. And how reading this painting, it actually, like paintings like this, it took us a while to get a sense of it. If you recall the paintings that Shrey showed you in part one, where we showed her early childhood and the paintings that she made in 2018, her sense of perspective is not at all this vanishing point Western idea of perspective. It's very much like everything is brought to the forefront, everything is flattened out, and the way you can tell what is behind and what is uh, in front is based on like how things are ordered, and also um, how things are concealed. Like if something is surrounding something else, the idea is that that object is being used in some way to hide. If something is on top, that means that that thing is in the open, and it takes a bit of work because some of this is from the Pithora tradition that she has inherited, but a lot of it is also her own style, which she has sort of figured out. It's literally like she's building a visual vocabulary that is uniquely hers. So it takes some degree of patience to kind of get used to that. But when you once you do start to see it, and you see it in the coming paintings, uh, it really shows what a unique artist she is. This is another peacock, and here you can see that the dots are really sort of taking shape, like they're forming this concentric pattern from the outline inwards, and she's kind of leaning into the triangular tail rather than the feathered one that we saw earlier. And you can see that she applies these dots to all of the other figures. And also she's starting to, like, this is a phase that she went through in the middle where she created solid blocks of color with dots for all figures in a painting, and also flora. And the flora you can see is something she's not really focusing on much, because if you look at the previous paintings, the flora hasn't like changed that much, but the peacocks have changed a lot, and so have the human figures. Here, this is the last peacock painting, but here you can see that the dots are really compressed, really compact, and in a very clear pattern, which is quite independent of the outline. Like earlier, you see the outline is kind of the dots have the same pattern as the outline, is just like shrinking inwards and being concentric. But here, the dots have a wavy and sometimes angular pattern. So that is that's something different that she started to do. And also you'll see that the dots, each row of dots is a contrasting color to the rows before and after it. So it has this somehow like jewel like encrusted feel to it. And this is a painting from 2018, which is why it's markedly different from the ones she made in the 80s. And you'll also see that she has signed this one. These earlier ones, actually, some of them, we only realized that MAP had them in their collection because we were combing through the archive, but they had not initially been labeled as being Bhuribai's work because they were purchased by Abhishek Podar in the 80s, and because they didn't have her signature, they weren't attributed until we started going through the archives for this exhibition. But the ones that came later, because they had her sign, they can be attributed to her. So going back to the 80s again, this is an elephant, which is not at all a motif that she painted in the Pithora style before coming to Bhopal. In fact, she saw an elephant for the first time in Bhopal, and she was still sort of figuring out the particular stylistic traits that an elephant should have. Like the peacock has the triangular tail and so forth. So how does it work with the elephant? And perhaps because of the context in which she's seen the elephant, the in an urban space and not in the wild, all elephants that she paints are always accompanied by a human, a mahout. So, or a rider or a handler or whatever. In this case, it seems like there's someone who's handling the elephant, and there's also someone who's sort of playing with the elephant. It seems like a little girl, and you'll often notice that this sense of scale is often exaggerated because the painting sort of making a point. You know, this is a small child who's playing with the elephant, and that is a handler, and so forth. So this elephant that she made recently in 2018, this is very clearly different. And here again, she's used the dots very skillfully. And you can see that, you know, she's made certain sort of formal choices. Like she's taken the two-eyed elephant and made it, given it a single eye, you know, in profile. She has taken the elephant with two ears, one that seems to be on top of its head and one on the right. And she has made it a singular form. So these are the sort of naturalistic choices that she makes occasionally. But at other times, you know, she might simplify the elephant's foot so that it goes better with her style. And sometimes you notice interesting ways in which she incorporates Pithora styles. Like, for example, the saddle that the mahout is sitting on, it looks a lot like those Pithora horses, you know, like this one. So that is one motif and how it has changed. Another element is the composition. So this painting, again from 2018, and so are the next few. Here you can see that firstly the palm tree is very, very different from the flora that you saw earlier. You know, if you look at earlier flora like this one, there's a huge evolution in this with these paintings. And this is a scene from her village when she was a child, when a tiger had visited the well, visited as like sort of wandered into the village and had gone to the well for water. But she hadn't actually seen this in person. She heard about it from others, and she was staying inside the house at the time. So this is part of what Trey might have mentioned earlier about how a lot of her paintings they function as memory making devices. And this is another instance of that, except it's not really her memory. It's a memory of someone else that she knows from hearsay. And this is possibly a reason why the tiger doesn't quite look like a tiger. But at the same time, other animals that she draws, like the peacock, also don't have their characteristic patterns. You know, they are also they're also a block of color, and you know, full of dots. So it's often unclear what is blurred memory and what is a stylistic choice with some of her motifs. And another thing I want to point out is also that this scene is a lot more compact if you compare it to, I mean, this is an actual scene, right? Like if you look at the earlier paintings, many of them they are like, this is a scene also, but it's not quite as tight. Like this is not a scene. This is a series of motifs. And of course, this is not a value judgment or anything. This is just a mark of how she has made certain decisions to change her style over the years, over this 60-year period. Sorry, 40-year period. And after this, we see this scene where around the time when she was 5 years old, as you can see in the description, where the children would drink this drink called sindha that was made from the date palm, and you can also see the birds that are nesting in the palm trees, and how she has kind of very like very snugly placed these birds in these branches, and how the palm trees almost seem to have this kind of like crown shyness between each other, but it doesn't happen in real life. But she's kind of made that stylistic choice to make their branches kind of flow into each other but not touch. And that this kind of composition is something that, you know, she has gotten closer and closer to over the years. especially because her work often revolves around her memories as a child, and also her early experiences as an artist. So it stands to reason that narrative scenes, or even like standalone depictions of events, would be more of a focus for her. Whereas earlier, she wasn't really, like, at the beginning of her career, she wasn't really looking back at much. She was still she was a very young person, and she wasn't really like, she didn't perhaps feel the need to make autobiographical paintings. But recently, this has become more of a tendency. And the last work in this is a sari, which uh, I'll just change the screen to give you a closer look at it. Yeah. So, this sari is something that she had made to as a kind of tapestry of her motifs. I mean, it's a proper sari with the border and a pallu and everything. And the body of the sari consists of all of the various motifs that you'll find in her work. And some of these will be familiar to you from what you've just seen. Like, for example, if you look at my cursor, this is a geometric Pithora horse. This is one of the tattoos. These are, this is a palm tree, like the ones that she made later. And there are also others that she didn't use that often, like, for example, these lizards. They're more of a rare motif in her paintings, but you do see them on occasion. And also all the various different like permutations and combinations of human figures. Human figures together, human figures individually, figures engaged in particular kinds of work, labor in the fields, construction work, etc. So this in particular, I find this very interesting because it's almost like a map or a guide to her works. You can like see what tends to recur and what doesn't. So yeah, so that is the end of the last part of the exhibition. I'll just stop the share now.
Um,
Yeah.
Mustafa, would you also like to talk about the essay a little bit? Although we were supposed to talk about it beforehand because of the joining in delays, there was a little
Yeah,
bit of a
sorry.
mix up there on my part. Sorry for that.
No, that's okay. I don't know. I mean, the essay is kind of a background. Okay, let me see. Okay, so yeah, so the essay was supposed to happen in the beginning. Um, it's 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 a sort of it's part of the further reading section of the exhibition. And okay, I'll just move into presenter view. So the essay is designed to basically give you a sense of um, what kinds of issues there have been historically pertaining to indigenous art, and also therefore what contemporary indigenous artists have to deal with when they are working in the mainstream. And when I use terms like mainstream, what I mean is um, uh, essentially non-indigenous people and non-indigenous society. So a society that has an urban-centric model, that has historically had an urban-centric model, and or in the case of India, perhaps like an upper caste society or an upper class society, or even those that function within that structure, and not say indigenous or Adivasi communities who operate in a sort of parallel structure at the same time. Uh, so, like, for instance, a lot of indigenous societies don't inherit directly from the West, whereas in India, the Indian mainstream does actually inherit a lot from the West through colonialism, but still. And so that's why I'm going to use terms like indigenous and Adivasi rather than tribal, because tribal comes with a certain set of connotations. I mean, it could be used innocently, but sometimes tribal, it implies a sort of a primitive social unit, and that's not the sense we want to give at all. So this essay you can find at the end of the exhibition, like if you scroll all the way down. I'll just be going through certain highlights of it and what it covers. So this is a mask from Benin, and it, uh, like uh, like many other artifacts from Africa, Australia, and South Asia, this was basically, I mean, essentially just taken as an aesthetically pleasing object and brought into Western collections. And obviously, this is problematic. But at the same time, this also happens on such a large scale that it disrupts a lot of indigenous practices. And it also kind of creates a certain idea of indigenous practice in the West. And later, through education systems within the colonized country, back to the mainstream society in that country. So we also inherit, ironically, we inherit the Western gaze that it started out with. This is perhaps a more darker side of how this appropriation happens. So these are Jivaron shrunken heads made by the Jivaron people uh, who traditionally live in the Amazon rainforest, and it is part of certain headhunting rituals that they historically participated in. But some of these are authentic, so to speak, and some of these are imitation shrunken heads. That's because at a certain point in the 19th century and also the early 20th century, uh, these objects like this got commodified by Western buyers. In fact, there were curio shops. Curio shops basically they sold artifacts that had a certain that inspired a certain kind of morbid fascination in Western buyers, because Victorian morality did not quite allow people to appreciate these objects as aesthetic objects like they did with let's say this mask from Benin. But there was also a certain desire to justify colonialism as a practice, and and shrunken heads like this allowed people to do that. The idea, it sort of bolstered the idea that indigenous communities were somehow primitive and so forth. So these are an example of that, and then imitation versions of these objects were also created, and a whole supply chain was formed. And headhunters, after a certain point, they began to do what they do, not as part of their indigenous ritual, but as part of like just as a business. You make shrunken heads because there is a market for it. This is a shield that belonged to a Guegal or Aboriginal warrior uh, from Australia, and a lot of scholars believe that this particular shield, the bullet that you see in the center of it, was fired by Captain Cook in the 1700s during a battle with Aboriginal people. Captain Cook was one of the main settlers uh, in Australia, and this particular object is currently in the British Museum, and a lot of Aboriginal activists in Australia have been demanding that it be returned to Australia. The interesting thing about objects like this is that they are part of the reason why the museum was created in the first place. The idea of the museum isn't just that you show art that is of the time where people are alive or art from the region. But the museum is partly also colonial construction. That's why so many Western museums have most of their collections are actually things from well outside of Europe and America. So these these objects they raise an interesting question of how does a Western museum today that has objects like this, how does it come to terms with the fact that these objects were essentially looted and presented to the public in the West, while also simply not giving them back. And at the same time, it's worth asking, like, what does it mean to give something back? The Australia that it was taken from is long gone, you know, and it is essentially a majority settler population in Australia. So, and at the same time, if it does come back, how does this change the nature of the museum? And this is something that a lot of museums in India also are kind of grappling with. If you go to the essay, uh, you'll get a better sense of this. But for now, I'll just leave the question there. So the essay also talks about photography as a practice that it's not a product, it's not a form, it's not an indigenous art as such, but it is something that it's an art form which was defined through its viewing of indigenous people. Back in the 19th century, especially in British colonies or French colonies, the thing you did with the camera was ethnic photography. That was it wasn't like an ethical choice or anything. It was just simply understood as something you do with the camera. Like today, a big part of what you do with the camera is perhaps taking a selfie or documenting life around you. So at that time, one of the things you did with the camera was ethnographic photography of indigenous people, of non-white people, etc., and or archaeological photography. So books like this, like The Oriental Races and Tribes by William Johnson and William Henderson, they were for a lot of people in the West, they were the main way in which they saw indigenous people and indigenous faces and bodies. So naturally, a big part of it was that because the photograph is seen as a truth-telling device, and also because at the same time, uh, the human body is recorded very clearly in a photograph. The largely now debunked practice of anthropometry, where various parts of the human body are measured and different ethnicities and their proportions are compared, and it's a basically a racist colonial practice that was done through photography, as you'll see in other slides. I'll just draw your attention to, sorry, yeah, to this particular work by Pushpamala N, where she actually parodies this practice, and she will use. She's a contemporary artist, but she parodies in a particular series of works, Native Women of South India, Manners and Customs, which is also sort of titled like one of these books. She deliberately, like, she formatted photographs and staged photographs such that it appears as though she is the subject of anthropometric photography. And this is also a form of appropriation, by the way. This is appropriation of colonial practices, and is you could say a rare case of positive use of appropriation. But coming back to ethnographic photography, a part of the reason why ethnographic photography was also done was to kind of profile various indigenous groups. So in this case, you can see in the shot of a Kol woman from the people of India, published in 1868. Uh, the Kols were actually the Kol community, the Santal community, and many others were actually profiled as possible criminal tribes. because that was part of what photography was used for, to sort of decide that, certain groups of people are trustworthy, certain are not, and the people of India is very clear about this agenda. So, uh, uh, and this kind of this has a strangely kind of prophetic tendency where, because a lot of indigenous communities were actually right at the forefront of pushing back against the British. In fact, the coal uprising in Chota Nagpur happened in the 1830s, so well before what we think of as the first major pushback against the British, which is in 1857. Well before that, the coal people were actually pushing back against new land laws that the British had passed. And then you have the Santal revolt of the 1850s, and then much later, of course, the Nakshal movement in the 60s, and also, this tends to happen in many parts of the world. It just often goes undocumented. Like another famous case more recently would be the Zapatista movement in Mexico in the 90s. So this practice of using photography to kind of decide who is criminal and who isn't was like, it has very deep roots in colonial history. And coming back to appropriation, this would be an instance of how Western artists have historically appropriated indigenous art. So this is on the left, you see a painting by Pablo Picasso, one of his most famous ones, and on the right is an Mbangu mask from Central Africa, probably made by the Pende people. And the mask is supposed to is supposed to be worn in a ritual or in certain ceremonies to symbolize an internal conflict within a person. That's why the facial features are actually kind of asymmetrical. There is, sorry, one second. Oh, I think we've lost someone. Anyway, yeah. So you'll see that the facial features are quite asymmetrical, and that's meant to kind of show a brief moment of mental illness or internal conflict. But in Picasso's work, you don't see any of this. I mean, he kind of uses the mask. If you look at the figures in the painting on the right side, he just uses the mask as an aesthetic object, and no reference was made to it. In fact, like everything that was called as African period was spoken of in retrospect after these connections were established by other scholars. But at the time, it was like, oh, he has referenced this thing, okay, whatever. So contrast that with how Pushpamala and other artists like her talk about indigenous history in their work. Like a kind of reverse appropriation of the colonial forces that were active in shaping the way we see indigenous people. Yeah, so here we have a Patwa artist, Swarna Chitrakar, with what was historically known as a Santal scroll. So a Santal scroll is, I mean, they weren't actually made by the Santal community. They were actually made by Jadu Patwas who traveled through different parts of Eastern India. And they were a painting community and also a storyteller community. So they basically, they performed a particular community's mythology and stories for them and created imagery for them. So they naturally made a lot of scrolls depicting Santal culture and Santal beliefs, and also performed with these images. But scholars have, for a long time, since the early 20th century, and all the way until recent times, it was thought of that it was believed that these are actually scrolls made by Santal people, because naturally, if you have a certain belief system, the paintings that depict it would be made by you. So this is the kind of logic which tends to come from mainstream scholars. I mean, like I said, despite good intentions, this bridge is something that needs to be created because it's not naturally there. This understanding of Adivasi knowledge systems and cultural systems is something that takes quite a bit of unlearning to understand. And lastly, this is a painting by Jangar Singh Shyam, and also I'll just quickly reference back to Bhuribai's um, other paintings that you would have seen earlier, and point out that you can see the similarities in the use of the dots and the lines and the patterns inside the form. So, but what I actually want to highlight here is something that the essay takes quite a bit of time to look at, which is how contemporary artists navigate the mainstream art world, knowing how indigenous contemporary artists navigate the art world, knowing that all of these influences are there. There is like at the same time they have to fight this idea that they are representing a tradition and nothing else. They are not actually, I mean, they are artists in their own right. They're not simply here to show us what a Bhil artist creates or what a Gond artist creates and so forth. They do create their own unique images, as Jangar Singh Sham actually did. Like almost his entire body of work that he had produced in his lifetime was entirely his own style and vision. And yet, during his lifetime, he was often thought of as, sort of showing the world what Gond artists create. But that wasn't the case at all. In fact, he kind of created a tradition called Jangar Kalam, which his members of his family and other associates actually kind of followed after he passed, and also during the latter half of his lifetime. So what was initially a single person's style now becomes a kind of tradition, and that is something that you don't find very often in mainstream art. Because this notion that an indigenous artist is working within a tradition is something that they end up using to navigate through the mainstream art world itself. And so yeah, so that's essentially the last point I wanted to make with about this essay, that indigenous artists have to. It's a very tricky balancing act, working with tradition, creating your own style, and also creating your own tradition at the same time, and also finding a place in the market in between all of this. So I'll stop the share now. And Shrey, is there anything you'd like to add?
No. If we have time, and I'm not sure we do, but if we do have time, I'd like to show. If we have some time, I would love to show everybody some photographs from the time we met Puribai, and a little bit more about the process of putting this exhibition together. I mean, it's only if we have time, so I'm not sure. We don't have time. We don't have time.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. I wish I could show you. These are just photographs of Puribai at her home when we visited her. Looking through these, like I mentioned, she has piles of written material on her, flyers, magazines, publications, leaflets, and so on. But we don't have the time. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Mustafa, for the last bit. I'd love to encourage all of you who have joined us today to take some time out, perhaps if not today, then tomorrow, and go through the exhibition at your own pace, because there are so many little hidden gems that we really couldn't talk about. We couldn't go into depth. In fact, reading Bhuribai's own words is almost like being led on a journey. It's like the artist is taking you through a walkthrough, the way we did this. The entire exhibition, it feels like she's by you and she's telling you about how she came to be where she is, and what has happened along the way. Um, I'd also uh, I'd also suggest that everyone read the essay that Mustafa has put together. It helped all of us when we were doing the exhibition referring to the essay helped keep us grounded, but it also helped us remember why we are making the effort of doing the exhibition this way, and not just the way exhibitions on Bhuribai have been done so far. There is also a reading list that we have provided, which is again linked at the bottom of the exhibition. If anybody is interested in reading more about indigenous art, about indigenous artists, Dr. Annapurna Garimella writes very beautifully on the subject, very critically on the subject. So it's all part of the suggested reading package. With that, I'm closing, and the floor is open for any questions you may have. Um, Please feel free to. We'll answer the best we can. And if there are no questions, I believe we can begin wrapping up. I'm actually unable to find the question and answer.
So we have the Q&A button at the bottom here.
There, I can see.
So we have one question. Yeah, sorry, I'll just start my video. Yeah, so one question is curious about the earlier paintings. How did you identify them? Yeah, so this is a good question. I would say that we had gotten really used to looking at the works that she could confirm were hers, and that we've seen of hers, and also we kind of and many of them were misattributed. Like some of them would be attributed to Jangar Singh Sham or Ladobai and so forth. So we compared these possible Bhuribai paintings painted by other artists, and we found that like there are minute differences. Like for example, Bhuribai will keep the dots in place, whereas Jangad would sometimes kind of blend them together, into lines. And also the motifs that she used early on, they are like they discounted a lot of the other indigenous artists when you compare them. So yeah, so that was largely it. And of course, we had Bhuribai to ask for her opinion or ask her whether she had made this painting or not. Although there was a bit of a communication problem, so that wasn't, we couldn't immediately do that, but we would send her a few pictures of paintings, and we would ask like, are these yours or not? But yeah, it involved a lot of combing through the archive and so forth.
Also, it's interesting how we found some of the paintings from really long back. One moment, I'll just start my video. It's very interesting how we found some photographs of Bhuribai's paintings, because we were really, scrambling, trying to find some of her older works. And when we say it's hard finding them, we mean it's actually really hard to find old old paintings by Bhuribai. And so we were very pleasantly surprised to know that Jyoti Bhatt had photographed her work at some point. So what we did then was comb through stacks and stacks of Jyoti Bhatt's diaries, cross-relate dates, and eventually we found that the first paintings that Bhuribai had ever done, Jyoti Bhatt had taken photographs of them. And so we do have a record of those. I will just take the other question from Kamini. Jagdish Swaminathan played a big role in Bhuribai's path as an artist. Does she see herself similarly playing a role in the next generation of Bhil artists? Wow, that is actually a very interesting question, because Bhuribai has trained a lot of young Bhil people to paint in a certain style. Whether the downside of it or the upside of it is this, I cannot say. I mean, it's for you to decide whether it's the downside of that or upside of it. But most of their paintings look very similar. They've sort of started to fit into what we imagine to be Bhil painting, where Bhuribai sort of lay the foundation for what is recognizable as Peel painting. These youngsters that she teach, which includes her own daughter, her sons-in-law, and so on, and they do very well. They sell their works as well. While they find their own subject matter, you will notice that their works have come to look similar. She definitely sees herself as she sees herself as a pioneer. She's extremely proud of it, of course, but she doesn't see herself taking the same role as Swaminathan did. By the way, she reveres Swaminathan as almost akin to God, because amongst the Peel, they believe that those who've passed away, you know, they remain watching over you as Baba Dev. So whereas she equates Swaminathan almost with God. Not almost. She did say he's like God to her. After his passing, she doesn't see herself taking the same role. Rather, she sees herself as mentoring Peel artists on ways to A, produce art, but B, she's also teaching them color, she's teaching them form, she's teaching them how to make paintings that will sell. Because you have to see that they are not artists purely because they have a calling to art. There are artists who do art not with an aim to sell. They're very happy to produce art, but these are people who are actually making a living off of their art form. And so, yes, she has trained upwards of, I think, 100 Peel artists. They call themselves Peel artists, and often it's very hard to tell their works apart from each other. But Bhuriba, as you can always tell, is just hers, but the rest not so much. So, yeah, there are quite a few Peel artists. All emporiums, all government emporiums, sometimes in the Crafts Museum, you can buy like Peel painting, and it'll most probably be somebody that has been trained by Bhuribai. So yeah, that is the answer to that. Do we have more questions? I'm so sorry, I cannot see the questions tab, and I feel a bit lost. If there's Shilpa, are there? Oh, no more questions. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody
Okay.
once again for joining us. Over to
Thank
Shruti and
you.
Shilpa.
Yeah.